Welcome, my friends. Today you will hear one of the most gripping and tragic frontier stories ever recorded, the haunting tale of the Hannon family. This episode is filled with suspense, raw emotion, and moments that will stay with you long after the final words fade. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories, and now, settle in. Enjoy the listening. This story will move you deeply.
The frontier of the Carolina backcountry in the mid-1770s was a land defined by tension, hardship, and the relentless uncertainty of survival. Families who settled along the dense forests and winding rivers carved out their existence, with little more than determination and faith, relying on the strength of their own hands to build cabins, raise livestock, and establish small pockets of civilization in a region still largely controlled by nature and shadowed by conflict. Among these settlers stood the Hannon family, whose farm sat near the banks of the Appalachian River, a location isolated enough to provide fertile ground for crops and quiet for daily life, yet exposed enough to offer little protection when danger moved across the land. The Hannons were not strangers to the risks of frontier life. Stories of raids, skirmishes, and unrest passed between families like warnings carried on the wind. Still, most settlers clung to the belief that misfortune visited others, not them. They woke each morning, tended their livestock, split logs, and prepared meals, holding tight to the fragile hope that their small patch of earth would remain untouched by the growing violence of the era. For months, the region had felt increasingly unstable as tensions between white settlers and the Cherokee Nation intensified. Rumors of conflict drifted from cabin to cabin, describing burned homesteads and families who had vanished without trace. Yet even with these warnings, the Hannons began that fateful morning like any other, unaware that within hours their world would be reduced to ashes. The day was clear, with a crisp breeze rolling through the valley and stirring the leaves that gathered around the edge of the clearing. The Hannon children were scattered across the property, performing their chores. William, the eldest boy, gathered water from the creek. Edwin, only 10 years old, helped split kindling while watching over his younger siblings. 7-year-old Winnie rocked the newborn infant, Elizabeth, who slept swaddled against her chest. It was a morning of ordinary motions, familiar sounds, and small responsibilities that gave shape to life on the frontier. But somewhere beyond the tree line, unseen by the family, a small war party had already crossed the river. Whether driven by anger, retaliation, or opportunity, they moved through the forest with silent precision, tracking the thin column of wood smoke that rose above the Hannon cabin. The boundary between safety and danger on the frontier was only ever the width of a forest, and on that morning the distance collapsed entirely. The attack came swiftly, brutally, and without warning. The first sound to split the air was a war cry so sharp and violent that it seemed to tear the morning apart. Before any member of the family could react, the warriors broke from the trees, advancing with a speed that left no room for escape or defense. The Hannons were caught in the open, with no time to barricade the cabin, no chance to reach for weapons, and no possibility of gathering the children. Chaos erupted across the clearing. The older family members fell almost immediately, struck down by tomahawks and musket fire as the warriors surged forward. Screams rose through the smoke and confusion, but they were quickly drowned out by the ferocity of the assault. In the span of mere moments, 7 members of the family lay dead or dying. The attack was conducted with ruthless efficiency, leaving no opportunity for the victims to resist, plead, or flee. Amid the terror, instinct overtook reason in the surviving children. Edwin bolted from the cabin the moment he saw an opening. His heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted toward the creek, clutching nothing but his will to survive. He knew of an old hollow log near the muddy bank, a place he had once explored during play. Now it was his only hope. Branches tore at his arms and legs as he ran, and behind him he heard the blood-chilling war whoop of a warrior who had spotted his escape. But the forest offered cover, and the bow's small size allowed him to slip between thickets and fallen branches. Just as he reached the creek, he dropped to the ground, crawled on his stomach, and wriggled into the hollow trunk. The smell of damp wood and rotting leaves filled his nostrils as he pushed himself deeper, squeezing into the darkness. Outside, the shouts of the warriors faded, replaced by the crackle of flames and the cries of animals fleeing the farm. Winnie, on the other side of the property, clutched the newborn tightly to her chest. Her instincts were not shaped by training or advice but by the raw terror of a child who understood that death surrounded her, She darted into a laurel thicket, the branches scraping her arms as she forced her way into the shadows of the tangled shrubs. She crouched low, trembling violently, trying to muffle the infant's soft whimpers. The slightest cry could give them away, and she pressed her cheek against the baby's head, silently pleading for silence. She did not know where her brothers were, nor whether her parents remained alive. All she knew was that if she moved, if she breathed too loudly, they would be found. Back at the farm, the warriors seized the family's ox and slaughtered it for food. The clearing filled with the smell of blood and smoke as they carved the animal and prepared a quick feast. When they finished, they approached the cabin, tore apart anything of value, and scattered belongings across the dirt floor. Clothing, tools, blankets, and keepsakes were taken or destroyed. The structure itself, built from months of labor, was then set ablaze. Flames climbed the walls with frightening speed, consuming the roof and sending thick black smoke billowing into the valley. The fire crackled loudly, the roof beams snapping under the heat, and sparks drifted upward into the sky like embers of a world ending. From her hiding place, Winnie watched the fire rise above the treetops. Her small body shook as she tried to understand what she was witnessing. The cabin that had sheltered her since birth was now a pillar of flame, and the figures dancing in the firelight were the same men who had destroyed her family. The warriors shouted triumphantly, celebrating their ray, before disappearing back across the river toward the forbidden forest. When the final echoes of their shouts faded, an unnatural silence settled over the farm. No bird sang, no livestock moved, no familiar voices called out. The world had gone hollow. Hours passed in that silence. Edwin remained pressed against the damp interior of the hollow log, fighting the urge to cry or flee. Every rustling leaf sounded like footsteps. Every crack in the distance seemed like the approach of a warrior. Only when the afternoon sun angled through the trees and the valley remained still, did he find the courage to crawl out. His legs trembled beneath him as he stood, covered in dirt and sweat. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air. He made his way slowly toward the cabin site. When he emerged from the trees, the scene before him was almost beyond comprehension. The cabin was reduced to smoldering embers. The yard was littered with debris, charred wood, and the remains of their possessions. The bodies of his family lay scattered across the property, silent and still. Edwin's breath caught in his throat, but survival pulled him forward. He forced himself to keep moving. As he neared the ruin, a slight movement caught his eye. In the shadows of the forest, Winnie emerged from the laurel thicket, still holding the infant Elizabeth in her arms. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, her dress torn, and her hands trembling. But she was alive, and the baby, miraculously, remained quiet. The siblings stood facing each other across the ruins of their world, too stunned to speak if they had been able. Without instruction, they came together, clinging to the only family they had left. The children knew they could not stay. Nightfall would bring cold, darkness, and danger. They had no food, no shelter, and no idea whether the warriors might return. Instinct, more than knowledge, guided them as they began walking along the riverbank. They took turns carrying the baby, resting only briefly when exhaustion forced them to pause. Each step was heavy, but the need to find help pushed them onward. The sun moved slowly across the sky, casting long shadows through the valley as the siblings trudged along the forested path. By late afternoon their legs ached, and hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Still, they continued, driven by the faint hope that somewhere down the river another settler had built a cabin, a place where lights still burned and voices still spoke. The landscape around them changed gradually from dense woods to open meadows, and finally to the cleared fields of another homestead. As the sun began to sink beyond the horizon, Colonel John Earl stepped out onto the porch of his home, surveying the land as he often did in the evenings. He saw movement at the edge of his property and narrowed his eyes. What approached was not an adult, nor a traveler, but 3 children mud-covered, terrified, and stumbling from exhaustion. As they neared the cabin, their condition became clear. The soot on their clothing, the tear-stained faces, the infant swaddled in trembling arms. They were survivors of a tragedy that would echo through the history of Polk County for generations. The colonel moved to meet them, stunned by the sight. Somehow, against staggering odds, Edwin, Winnie, and baby Elizabeth had survived the massacre that had claimed the rest of their family. Their arrival marked not the end of their suffering, but the beginning of a story that would be retold long after the frontier had changed, long after the cabin had burned to ash, and long after the valley had forgotten the screams that once tore through its quiet morning air. The first chapter of the Hannon tragedy closed, with the children standing before the Earl homestead exhausted, orphaned, and forever changed, unaware that the nightmare they had endured would haunt their memories for decades to come and shape the legacy of an entire region's frontier history. The morning after the attack on the Hannon homestead rose over the Carolina backcountry with a stillness that belied the horrors of the previous day. A pale fog drifted over the Appalachian River, settling among the reeds and brush, softening the edges of the landscape that had been so violently reshaped by human hands. Yet no mist could conceal the truth of what had occurred. In the heart of that frontier wilderness, 3 children now stood at the threshold of a world forever divided into before and after. Their survival marked them as witnesses to a tragedy that would echo across generations, and their recovery will unfold slowly, marked by grief, fear, and the relentless demands of life on the edge of settlement. Colonel John Earl wasted no time providing the children shelter. His cabin, sturdier and more fortified than most frontier homes, was built on higher ground overlooking a broad field. Its thick log walls and solid stone chimney gave the sense of permanence rarely found in the region. Inside, the air was warm from the morning fire, and the smell of wood smoke mingled with the scent of bread, broth, and fresh hay. For the Hannon children, whose last memory of home was fire and destruction, the contrast was almost impossible to process. They were ushered inside, tended to gently, and given water, blankets, and what little comfort could be offered. Yet, even in this safer space, fear clung to them like a second skin. Edwin flinched at sudden sounds, his eyes darting constantly toward the windows and door. His thin frame trembled from both cold and shock. Winnie, still holding the infant, refused to let go of her sister even when her arms grew numb from fatigue. She stayed close to the shadows, barely speaking, her small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Baby Elizabeth cried from hunger and discomfort, her cries echoing faintly in the corners of the cabin, reminding everyone present of how fragile this new reality was. The colonel and his wife worked with practiced calm. Life on the frontier had taught them that tragedies were not rare, and survival was often a matter of swift action and resilience. They cleaned the children's wounds, prepared food, and set out spare clothing. There was no space for hysteria, more time for despair. The Earl household understood that these children were now entirely their responsibility, and they approached the task with the quiet determination of people who had long accepted that hardship came with the land. Their kindness did not erase the children's trauma, but it created the first fragile layer of stability upon which the next chapter of their lives could be built. As the day progressed, neighbors arrived at the Earl homestead to learn what had happened. Word had spread quickly along the river. The smoke had been seen rising above the valley the previous afternoon, and whispers of an attack had already begun to circulate. Small groups of settlers gathered near the cabin, speaking in low voices, their faces marked by shock and anger. Conflict along the frontier was not new, but the killing of nearly an entire family, women, men, and children, left a mark that would not be easily forgotten. The settlers rode out in groups to inspect the ruins of the Hannon farm, following the same path the children had walked only hours before. When they returned, their grim expressions confirmed the magnitude of the loss. The cabin had collapsed into a charred shell, its timbers reduced to blackened stumps. The bodies of the deceased were found scattered among the debris, some near the house, others near the barn or the fields where they had attempted to flee. The air around the ruins carried the heavy, unmistakable scent of burned wood and death. It was a sight that hardened even the most seasoned homesteaders. The settlers buried the dead in a small clearing not far from the river, marking the graves with wooden crosses. For Edwin and Winnie, whose hearts were still too shaken to understand the permanence of burial, the news that their parents and siblings had been laid to rest brought a silent grief that would remain with them for years. They did not attend the burial. The colonel's wife kept them inside, away from the harsher tasks of reconstruction and mourning. The next days passed in a blur for the surviving children. They ate, slept, and learned how to exist again. The rhythms of the Earl household began to shape their new routines. Each morning started with the gathering of firewood, the feeding of animals, and the preparation of meals. Edwin, though still weak, began helping with chores, mimicking the actions of the older boys and men around him. His hands shook when he held tools, and sometimes the smallest sound sent him into a panicked freeze. Yet he pushed forward, driven by a need to prove he could be useful. The frontier did not offer idle space for grief. Survival depended on contribution. Winnie spent most of her time caring for baby Elizabeth. The infant required constant attention, feeding, cleaning, and soothing, and Winnie clung to the responsibility with fierce determination. The baby became her anchor in the new world, a fragile life she could protect even when she had been unable to protect anyone else. At night, she slept with Elizabeth cradled against her chest, waking at every movement, terrified that something might steal the last connection to her family. The colonel's wife tried to offer help, but Winnie resisted, her instinct for guardianship sharpened by the trauma of the attack. As the settlers strengthened their vigilance in the region, talk of the raid intensified. Men rode patrols along the river, checking for tracks or signs of movement. The community understood that this was not merely an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger pattern of escalating conflict. Fear spread among the homesteads, leading families to reinforce their cabins, keep weapons close, and gather at nightfall. The frontier had always been dangerous, but the massacre of the Hannon served as a stark reminder that danger could arrive without warning and leave devastation in its wake. Meanwhile, local leaders met to discuss the event and its implications. Reports were prepared for military authorities in the region, detailing the attack and requesting additional security for the settlements. The growing unrest between British-aligned Cherokee factions and Patriot-aligned settlers had already made the region unstable, and the tragedy only deepened mistrust and hostility. While blame and anger flowed freely among the settlers, the motivations behind such attacks remained complex, shaped by years of conflict, shifting alliances, and the pressures of colonial expansion. For the Hannon children, however, these geopolitical realities were distant and abstract. Their world had been reduced to two simple facts: their family was gone, and they had survived. In the weeks that followed, Edwin began to show signs of resilience. The structure and routine of farm work helped steady his mind. He helped gather stones from the field, carried water from the spring, and learned to care for the livestock. Yet, each task carried weight. The sound of a branch snapping could send him spiraling back into the memory of running toward the creek. The smell of smoke could stop him in his tracks, his breath quickening as the image of the burning cabin flashed across his mind. Trauma had etched deep grooves into his memory, and though he tried to hide his fear, it lingered beneath every movement. Winnie remained quieter than her brother. Her trauma settled differently, less visible, but deeply rooted. She shadowed the colonel's wife everywhere she went, always carrying Elizabeth or keeping the cradle within reach. She rarely ventured outside unless necessary, and whenever she did, she scanned the tree line with wide, watchful eyes. She was only 7, but the weight of responsibility had aged her in ways that neither time nor comfort could undo. Baby Elizabeth grew stronger as the weeks passed. She had no memory of the attack, no understanding of the loss that had reshaped the lives of her siblings. Her world was warm arms, steady hands, and the gentle rocking of the cradle. She became a symbol of fragile hope in the rural household, a reminder that life could continue, even in the shadow of devastation. As winter approached, the settlers worked together to ensure the children had adequate clothing, food, and shelter. The colonel formally took guardianship of them, and they became part of his extended household. Their presence added new responsibilities, but also deepened the bonds among the community, as neighbors brought blankets, tools, and food to help secure their survival. The frontier's harsh realities demanded unity, and the tragedy of the Hannon family drew settlers closer together, strengthening ties that would help them face the difficulties of the coming year. Despite the growing sense of stability, the emotional wounds remained raw. At night, Edwin often woke in a panic, drenched in sweat, his heart racing as the echoes of screams filled his dreams. He saw flashes of the attack, heard the pounding footsteps of the warrior who had chased him, and relived the moment he squeezed into the hollow log, praying he would not be discovered. The colonel found him outside one night, sitting alone on the steps, staring into the darkness. The boy said nothing, but the weight of his silence was enough to reveal the depth of his suffering. Winnie, too, carried scars that did not fade. Her nights were spent lying awake, listening for sounds that might signal danger. The cries of the baby triggered fears she could not fully name, and she often paced the floor long after the household had gone to sleep. Her small body was frail, yet her determination remained unbroken. She refused to sleep without the infant in her arms, clinging to Elizabeth as though letting go would mean losing the last piece of her former life. The settlers watched the children with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. They knew that such trauma could shape a person for life, and they understood that these children would never be the same as those who had not witnessed such horror. Yet they also recognized the strength required to survive what they had endured. The Hannon children embodied the harsh reality of frontier life. Suffering was inevitable, but survival was possible for those who could endure. As the season turned and the land shifted from green to brown, the memory of the attack remained vivid in the community's collective consciousness. The ruins of the Hannon cabin stood for months, a silent monument to the fragility of frontier settlements. Travelers who passed by spoke quietly of the tragedy, and new settlers arriving in the valley were warned of the dangers that still lingered in the forests beyond the river. The children grew slowly into their new lives, shaped by the rhythms of the Earl household and the support of the surrounding community. But beneath the surface, the memory of that dark day continued to define them. The trauma became part of their identity, a hidden thread woven through their thoughts and actions. They had survived a nightmare, yet survival did not erase the past. It only allowed them to carry it forward. The frontier moved on, as it always did, harsh, unforgiving, and indifferent to the tragedies that unfolded upon it. But for Edwin, Winnie, and Elizabeth, the events of that day became the foundation of the lives they would build, the families they would one day raise, and the stories they would carry into adulthood. Their journey was far from over. The scars of loss would follow them, shaping their future in ways they could not yet imagine. And while the community healed and the valley quieted, the memory of the Hannon massacre lingered like a shadow across the land, a reminder that the frontier demanded a price from all who sought to tame it. The passage of months along the Carolina frontier did little to erase the memory of the Hannon tragedy. Seasons shifted with their usual indifference, turning the forests from green to brittle brown, covering the ground with frost and then thawing it again, as winter yielded to spring. Yet for the three surviving children, time did not move in smooth cycles. Instead, it stretched unevenly, some days dragging with unbearable slowness, others rushing past before they could fully grasp them. Trauma did not follow the patterns of nature, it carved its own path, leaving marks deeper than the wounds of physical hardship. And though the Earl household provided shelter, routine, and a semblance of stability, nothing could completely sever the children from the haunting memories that clung to them. Colonel John Earl observed their growth with careful attention. He understood that children shaped by violence bore scars that did not fade easily. Edwin, now the unofficial eldest of his fractured family, took on responsibilities beyond his years. The colonel recognized a familiar hardness in the bow's posture, one he had seen in soldiers who had returned from battlefields forever changed. Edwin woke before dawn each morning, gathering firewood, hauling buckets from the spring, or tending to the livestock with a dedication born not from youthful enthusiasm, but from a need to occupy the spaces where fear threatened to rise. The bow moved through life with a quiet determination, rarely complaining, rarely asking for help, as though every task fulfilled was a small step away from the horrors he carried. Winnie, younger and far more fragile, navigated her new world with a different kind of vigilance. Her small frame moved silently through the Earl cabin, always close to the cradle or wherever baby Elizabeth lay. She kept the infant within reach at all times, her instincts honed by the terror of nearly losing her on the day of the massacre. Winnie's eyes seemed older than her years, shadowed by the memories she did not yet have the words to describe. She flinched at raised voices, even harmless ones, and avoided open spaces unless someone held her hand. Though she was cared for and loved by the Earl family, a part of her remained locked inside the laurel thicket where she had hidden with Elizabeth, clutching the infant while death moved across the clearing. The months following their arrival at the Earl homestead were marked by gradual adjustments. The children learned the expectations of their new household. They became familiar with the daily rhythms: breakfast at dawn, chores in the morning, quiet tasks in the evening when the sun dipped behind the hills. Neighbors visited less frequently as life regained its usual demands, and whispers of the massacre became folded into the larger tapestry of frontier lore. But even as the community returned to its routine, the Hannon children's trauma surfaced in unspoken ways. At night, Edwin's sleep was often shattered by his recurring nightmares. He awoke gasping, his heart pounding violently, his body drenched in sweat. The colonel sometimes found him sitting near the window before dawn, staring into the dark woods as though tracing the route of his escape. The memory of running toward the creek, pursued by a warrior whose cry still echoed in his mind, replayed endlessly. The hollow log where he had hidden became both his sanctuary and his prison. Even months later, he found himself glancing toward riverbanks and tree lines, instinctively searching for hiding places. Winnie's nightmares were quieter but no less devastating. She often woke silently, tears streaming down her face, her small arms tightening around Elizabeth as though the baby might disappear if she loosened her grip. The colonel's wife tried to comfort her, But Winnie clung to her sister with a protected desperation that only children who had faced death understood. The baby, unaware of the trauma surrounding her, slept peacefully in Winnie's arms, her soft breaths providing the only calm in the little girl's fractured world. As spring deepened into summer, the Hannon children's presence became woven seamlessly into the Earl household. They were not treated as burdens, but as family members whose sorrow demanded patience and understanding. The Colonel's wife taught Winnie small domestic tasks, helping her gather herbs, mend torn fabric, and prepare simple meals. These lessons gave the girl moments of quiet focus, small intervals where fear loosened its grip. Edwin learned to mend fences, plow fields, and handle livestock. His hands toughened, and he grew taller, though the intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. Each task became a step toward adulthood, forged prematurely by the day that destroyed his childhood. The settlers who lived nearby witnessed the children's transformation with a blend of sympathy and admiration. They understood that the frontier demanded strength, but they also recognized the remarkable resilience the children display. Surviving an attack that claimed 7 family members was an extraordinary feat, and the community regarded the siblings with a mixture of awe and respect. In their presence, people often fell silent, as though the weight of the children's experience demanded reverence. The valley remembered the massacre vividly, and the surviving siblings became living reminders of the fragility of life on the edge of settlement. Yet, as the seasons continued to turn, the deeper consequences of the tragedy emerged not in sudden outbursts, but in subtle shifts. Edwin matured faster than any child his age should. He took on responsibilities instinctively, often volunteering for tasks older boys avoid. He rarely laughed, and when he did, the sound carried a hollow edge, as though Joe could not fully penetrate the layers of memory that encased his heart. He watched over his sisters constantly, never allowing them out of his sight for long. The Colonel gently encouraged him to rest, to play, to engage with other children. But Edwin remained vigilant. He believed, deep down, that he alone bore the burden of ensuring his sister's safety, a belief shaped by the trauma of having failed to save the rest of his family. Winnie's path diverged from typical girlhood as well. Her entire identity became entwined with caring for Elizabeth. She fed her, rocked her, cleaned her, and soothed her when she cried. The baby became the center of her world, while other girls her age collected flowers or chased fireflies in the evening light. Winnie remained by Elizabeth's side, as though some invisible thread kept her tethered to the infant. The Colonel's wife worried that the girl's attachment ran too deep, but she understood its origin. Trauma created bonds that did not follow conventional logic. Winnie poured all her remaining innocence and tenderness into caring for the baby, because it was the only part of her life that the tragedy had not taken. Elizabeth, meanwhile, grew from a fragile infant into a curious toddler. She toddled across the cabin floor, grasping at furniture and reaching for anything within her line of sight. Her laughter brought light into the household. Even if she had no understanding of why the others sometimes grew quiet around her, she would eventually outgrow the cradle, climb into Winnie's lap unprompted, and cling to Edwin's legs whenever he entered the room. She became the living embodiment of hope in a story that had been marked by sorrow. Despite the steady rhythm of daily life, the trauma continued to shape the siblings in complex ways. Edwin avoided the stretch of road that led toward the ruins of the Hannon farm. He refused to accompany anyone who asked him to travel in that direction, and even passing mentions of the place triggered a visible tension in his shoulders. For Winnie, the sound of fire crackling in the hearth sent her trembling, her eyes fixed on the flames with an expression of dread. The Colonel's wife learned to prepare meals with less firewood, keeping the flames low to avoid distressing the girl. The community, still wary of further raids, strengthened its defenses. More settlers arrived, building cabins closer to one another, forming a fragile network of mutual protection. The memory of the Hannon massacre became a rallying cry for unity, caution, and preparedness. Men organized patrols and built crude fortifications around the most vulnerable homesteads. While the threat of attack never disappeared entirely, the settlers grew more confident in their ability to respond. Yet the fear never left completely. It lingered beneath the surface, just as the trauma lived within the surviving children. As years passed, the siblings entered adolescence, with the weight of their shared past shaping every decision. Edwin became known in the region as a man of steady character, quiet, disciplined, and unwavering in his responsibilities. He worked tirelessly, learned new skills, and eventually acquired land of his own. He married, raised a large family, and became respected among the settlers for his reliability and strength. But those who knew him closely spoke of the nights when he woke in a cold sweat, reliving the horrors of his childhood. His nightmares never fully stop, nor did the echoes of the Cherokee War cry fade from his memory. He learned to live with the haunting, carrying it with the same stoic endurance he applied to his labor. Winnie, on the other hand, never married. She remained with the Earl family well into adulthood, helping raise the younger children and tending to household responsibilities. Her attachment to Elizabeth never waned, even as the baby grew into a young woman. She lived a quiet life, marked by gentleness and reserve, her heart shaped by the tragedy she survived. Those who knew her spoke of her kindness, but also of a distant sadness that never fully left her. She bore her trauma inwardly, her silent suffering a testament to the burdens carried by those who witnessed violence they could not comprehend. Elizabeth's fate, however, became less clear. As she matured, she drifted for recur and memory, her story fading into uncertainty. Some believed she left the region in search of opportunity, others thought she may have married and changed her name, her identity becoming lost in the vast expanse of frontier history. Whatever the truth, her disappearance from documented life added a layer of mystery to the story of the Hannon children, one more thread woven into the fabric of Appalachian lore. Decades later, the land where the Hannon farm once stood transformed in ways no one from that tragic morning could have imagined. Civilization encroached upon the frontier. Roads were carved through the valleys, rail lines stretched toward distant cities, and small communities grew into towns. Eventually, on the very ground where the Hannon cabin had burned, a charming inn was built, a stately structure known as the Mimosa Inn. Tourists from across the country visited the peaceful property, admiring the serene landscape and the gentle roll of the Appalachian River. They walked the grounds without any knowledge of the bloodshed that had once stained the soil beneath their feet. The ruins of the cabin were long gone, replaced by gardens, walkways, and the quiet comfort of hospitality. Yet the past remained, even if only in whispers carried by those who knew the story. The survivors had lived out their lives, each carrying the shadow of the massacre within them. The tragedy became part of the region's forgotten history, resurfacing only in old family stories, scattered records, and the memories of those who understood how fragile frontier life had been. The valley healed, but the scars of the land, like the scars of the children, never truly disappeared. In the end, the story of the Hannon children stood as a testament to resilience forged in the most harrowing circumstances. They faced unimaginable terror, escaped with their lives, and built futures shaped by the unyielding demands of survival. Their legacy endured quietly, etched not in monuments or grand memorials, but in the generational stories passed down through families who still remembered that, on one quiet morning in the late 18th century, violence swept through the frontier and 3 small children walked out of the wilderness alive. And while the world moved on, the memory of the massacre remained a silent presence in the shadow of the mountains, a reminder that beneath the peaceful beauty of the Carolina landscape lies a history written in suffering, endurance, and the indomitable will to survive.